event. My name is Fuyubi Nakamura. I'm a curator for at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC, and also associate professor in the Department of Asian Studies here at UBC as well. I'm clearly the curator of the exhibition Entangled Territories, Tibet Through Images. Before we begin the event, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and ancient territory of Hankaminam-speaking masculine people. This land has been a place of learning for millennia for masculine people who have passed down their knowledge, history, language, and culture from one generation to another. I am grateful they allow us to be on their land to do our own learning. The Entangled Territories, the exhibition we currently have at the museum, was developed in collaboration with Tibetan Canadian community members and two artists featured in the exhibition. It presents Tibet through their lenses and voices. The exhibition showcases Tibet, its culture, and its communities in different light. The exhibition also aims to uplift the effort of Tibetan Canadian community members to maintain their culture and history in the face of challenges associated with migration and also loss of homeland. So I'd like to welcome you to this special discussion about the exhibition today with our special guest, Tsering Yangzom Lama, who is sitting next to me, and Dr. Kabir Mansingh Heimsath. So they offer insight into Tibet and its culture as they respond to the exhibition by reflecting on their respective work as a writer and also anthropologist. So please join me in welcoming our guest speakers. So first, I'd like to ask both of you to briefly introduce yourself, including your relationship to Tibet. So let's start with Tsering.
Hello? Okay. Thank you, Fuyubi, for having me, first of all. So, yeah, my name is Tsering, and I'm a writer. And I was born in Nepal, and my parents and grandparents fled Tibet during the invasion. And I grew up in an exiled Tibetan community in Nepal, and then later in Canada, and then in the US. So I've sort of lived in a few different places, which is pretty typical for Tibetans, especially those of my generation. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Hello. Yes. I think it's on. Okay. The sound is very weird here. I'm Kabir. I think my interest probably started with I was interested in philosophy and Buddhism, but had grown up back and forth in India, and Tibet was always what was beyond the mountains. And so eventually that drew me there. Once I physically went to Tibet, then Tibet itself became what was most fascinating to me, and I sort of left the abstractions in the background and became much more interested in what was going on in the ground, in Tibet, in Lhasa, and so that led me into anthropology and focusing much more on the contemporary life in Tibet itself. I was running academic programs in India, Nepal, Tibet for many years, about 15 years. At the moment, I'm teaching at a small college in Portland, Oregon, as an anthropologist. And I think I'll stop there as well and move on.
Thank you for your introduction. So the first question I have is for Tsering. In your novel, this one, that we measured Earth with our bodies, which is also available in the museum shop if you are interested. You tell a story of intergenerational Tibetan family and their exile and journey from Tibet, Nepal to Canada. So would you please tell us what you really wanted to share in this novel?
Well, when I was writing the book, I wasn't thinking about a message for the reader. It's not something that I mean, I didn't know that I would even have a reader, so that's not sort of, I didn't get that far. I was really thinking about evoking the experience of being alive as a Tibetan, and these specific Tibetans, you know, the characters that I was dealing with, what it feels like for them to be alive today, and within each moment, the sort of vertical experience of time that Tibetans live inside of, that the past is always inside of the moment, which led me to the structure of the novel, which is very much back and forth between times and also between voices. So in a sense, like, I guess entangled, right? Like the word entangled, but woven, I would say. So yeah, I was trying to create that experience of that woven feeling that I think it is to be Tibetan today.
Do you see any connection between your book and the exhibition here at the MOA right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think this exhibit is pretty singular. I think it's in the direction that things need to be going when it comes to institutions like museums and universities that typically have excluded Tibetans from decision making when it comes to their own objects. So what's interesting about this exhibit for me is that it provides a different model that is very much interested in involving Tibetans. From the exhibit with the young students, the young exiled, well, diasporic Tibetan students that live in Vancouver. It's a very personal exhibit. You know, they're choosing an object and then telling a story of why they're choosing that object, which I think is very different from the institutional voice of many museums and exhibits. And I think that because that's the choice that's made in this exhibit, what we get is a very personal storytelling, I guess, an act of storytelling. And that's what my novel is too, it's an act of storytelling. So I think it's the connection is very much that it is the voice of a Tibetan person, in my case, me, in that book. But the museum exhibit itself is a showcase of Tibetan voices, speaking in personal terms about something that is not theoretical to us, might be theoretical to others, but for us, each object is directly connected with our personal realities.
Thank you so much, Sherin, for sharing that. So the Kabir, you as also mentioned in your introduction, you have lived in Tibet for many years. You have many friends in Tibet too, and also know many Tibetan artists in Lhasa. And you actually introduced me to those wonderful artists in Lhasa when we went to Tibet together back in 2010. So I'm just curious that you could tell us what initially led you to explore Tibet, its culture and people and art.
I think, as mentioned, what initially drew me was just a very romanticized fascination with what was on the other side of the mountains. After spending, not even spending time, it was immediately on the initial visit to Lhasa. So for me, this would have been 1990. There's such a sort of visceral power to the place, and I became interested in what the relationship between the material, the physical environment, and the I don't really want to say culture as much as life of people who were living there. And in the 90s, it was changing so dramatically. From I would visit once and then 6 months later visit again, and things had changed so much. And then 4 months later, again, things had changed so much. And so through the 90s and 2000s, the environment was shifting so radically. And I was interested in how people were negotiating that physical shift in their own lives, in their everyday life. And I think that that's what really pulled me and kept me in Lhasa for many years. Is that okay?
And then just following on that, do you think the exhibition achieved to show Tibet through Tibetan perspective, from somebody who lived there for many years?
Yes. I think that I think what's most striking to me, maybe following a little bit on what Tsering was saying, is that I guess I don't think it's about a Tibetan perspective singular as much as, and what I think this exhibition does that perhaps other exhibitions or other museum sort of attempts are not quite as successful at, is that it's telling stories, as Tsering says, or voices or perspectives, plural. And I think something that this exhibition does is it's not trying to categorize and fix something in a way that at least historically, museums are known to do. And you put a tag, and there's an ascension number, and a date, and a provenance, and that's what it is. And I think here what we get is, a variety of voices from Tibetans, not from curators or anthropologists or historians or scholars. So yes, it's from Tibetans, but it's from Tibetans, plural. It's not from one person. And so there is no category necessarily. And I think that that's what I found very striking. And also I really love the way that the descriptions are hanging, and they're not anchored to the object. They're sort of floating in relation to, rather than fixing or framing in a rigid way. And I really appreciated that. And so in that sense, it's much more alive and then absolutely yes. In representative of Tibetans, plural, as being alive and various, yeah.
Thank you so much, Kabir, for your reflection. I appreciate it. The location and the status of the Tibetan homeland remains a central issue for many Tibetans. And then Tibetan Canadian community members, also other diasporic members, are questioning not only the diasporic conditions, but also reimagining what homeland means. So this question is more for Tsering. So would you kind of share with us what homeland means to you, thinking about Tibet or elsewhere?
The question of what home means is actually a very difficult question, and it's actually a common question. I get asked, I feel like I've been asked this quite a few times the last few years, sort of traveling around for my book. And on the one hand, I feel quite challenged by that question because it's the first thing that we're denied. And then the void of it is itself creates a center for us as a people who live like a net, without a center. So it's interesting that the thing that we don't have is a space of connection for us as Tibetans. But that's like when I'm feeling morose, Most of the time, home for me is a beautiful thing. And my homeland is one of the most beautiful places in the world. And so I access it in many ways, I think of writing as a space in which I access my home. It's like an endless terrain, in a sense. But I think for many Tibetans, within that sort of mythic beauty that Tibet has in our imagination is also this kind of vast void, and both coexist. And so it's homeland or home is this thing we encircle or circle around, or circumambulate. But for me, like as a I guess like an artist or whatever, there's like so much for me to work with within that void. So there's like a balance of kind of an electric pain and a ecstatic possibility with home and our relationship to home.
Thank you. But is there any particular work in the exhibition that makes you think of home or Tibet?
I think that Lodoloro's work is very, for me, quite moving, the way she approaches it. And in particular, her photographs of her father in the monastery in Nepal. Because as she describes it in this catalog, that monastery was meant to be temporary. And yet, as the sort of the generations sort of die off in her family that are associated with the monastery, that impermanent structure creates this kind of base or a basis. And she's herself, like many Tibetans, not able to fit in a neat category, you know? So like if somebody was to say like, what is an authentic Tibetan? Like that's a laughable question now, you know? It's like a ridiculous concept, first of all, this idea of an authentic Tibetan, because as Watermeyer writes about in her piece in this, she's, you know, somebody who grew up in Tibet, left, went into exile, returned, experienced the alienation of just what it is to be Tibetan, to exist between boundaries. And so, because everything is so contingent in that reality, it creates this kind of like precious kind of impermanence that's very palpable in Lodoloro's work. And also this kind of unease, like the photographs of her dressed in Victorian British clothing to represent her British ancestry, and then the Tibetan clothing to represent her Tibetan ancestry, and how neither can really suffice. And that's actually, I think, true for most Tibetans alive today. There is an essential alienation to our experience because of the experience, the historical reality of our time. You know, it's kind of like a bunch of shards as a result of a major rupture. That's like what it feels like, I think.
Thank you for sharing that, Jerry, because actually Lodoloro's father, Para, was here for the exhibition opening, and we had an event following the opening, and then we had a tour with the artists. And actually, in that time, actually, he spoke more than the artists and think about her work, which was really great and lovely too. So this is now for the Kabir. The exhibition explored how Tibet has historically represented by outsiders and how Tibetans now present and talk about Tibet. And as Jerry already mentioned, in this exhibition catalog, Kabir, you wrote an essay about actually photography in Tibet and how Tibet has been represented through a particular kind of photograph. So can you actually talk about how photography has played in creating particular type of image of Tibet and how Tibetans themselves are now participating in creating image of Tibet?
Yeah, I think that there's a fairly the earliest photographs of Tibet were taken by British colonials, and there's a fairly at this point sort of established critique of colonial photography of outsiders sort of coming in and taking pictures of the passive natives, and then taking those photographs back and putting them in museums or archives or for distribution amongst the Euro-American audience, and the natives, quote unquote, so to speak, aren't even necessarily seeing those photographs. And so that critique, I think, is quite well established. What to me is so interesting in Tibet in from the sort of 80s onwards, and increasingly so and ongoing, now maybe more exciting than ever, is the circulation of these sort of images back to Tibetans themselves, and the way that they engage with those representations. And one, it's not at all a sort of a passive role in that, oh shoot, they got us wrong, or oh shoot, they got us right, but it's an engagement with, is this robe worn the right way? Or because they're wearing this necklace, they must have been on the way to that ceremony or something like that. And so now there's a lot more engagement with what was once seen as a fairly monolithic archive, now has become much more interesting and active. Kunzong Kirong's the film piece works with this in terms of having a conversation with the archive, but then not just a conversation, but through that reclaiming and in some ways repurposing a colonial archive, which I think is very interesting, and it's part of something that's been going on globally, not just with Tibetans. So that's at one level, this sort of historic level. At a more contemporary level, I think what I was most engaged with in Lhasa is the way in which, in particular, tourism, first international, but then maybe even more importantly, Chinese tourism to Tibet was bringing, sort of recycling these images and expectations of what Tibetans should look like, and so forth. And Tibetans were very aware, are very aware and very active in that process. And just like any of us, start to incorporate the perceptions of others into the way that we perceive and represent ourselves. And I feel self-conscious that I'm not wearing a jacket and tie today because I'm an academic, and so I have a sense of what an academic is supposed to look like, right? So similarly, with Tibetans, I felt like there was this quite through the 90s and 2000s, this fairly in heightened self-consciousness about how they're presenting. I go on and on, but I'm gonna take it the next step. Is I think now, and something I know very little about, is that's just accelerated even further with social media and Instagram, and become very exciting because now, of course, there's a global circulation of images of Tibetans made by Tibetans for Tibetans, and they're not, we as in non-Tibetans, foreigners, may have very little to do with that even. And so I think that the circulation of images and self-perception and representation is shifting quite a lot in the last decade since social media has taken off. And I do have to say I know very little about that because I'm not active on social media. So, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
Actually, it's not a question I that provide earlier, but he also takes some photograph, and he has been taking many photographs in Tibet. And then can I actually ask you to talk about this particular image here? What's happening here? These are the three, right? Tibetan women dressed up in the photo.
Okay. Maybe first on photographs. I think I work in academia, but I think I find photography much more compelling in a way, in part because on the one hand it's much more immediate, meaning unmediated. But then also, it's also not, it's multivalent, right? It's not fixed, and so one image may mean different things to different people, and I think that that's something I really appreciate about photography and have tried, and so I try and work with that when I'm attempting to understand what's going on in Lhasa. That particular image came about with a trend that was happening in this would have been in the late 2000s, in which Tibetans, there were several, actually there weren't several, this was one of the first portrait studios that had opened in Lhasa, and it was run by a couple from Beijing, very artsy, urban Chinese who were fascinated with Tibet and had shared many of the same fascinations that globally people had with Tibet. And they had a portrait studio to sort of where Tibetans or any Lhasa resident could come, and they would work with the photographers to pose photographs in various locations. And what was interesting to me is the role that the photographer had alongside the participants in sort of choosing how these photographs were posed and staged and costumed. And so in this case, there were many young Tibetans who had grown up in Lhasa. They may have gone to school in mainland China, very sort of educated in a Chinese modern sense, who were sort of taking on roles as quote unquote traditional Tibetans, and they were doing so very, again, very knowingly that this was this is an interesting role to take. It was like a play acting, and then they would go back and go out to a club that evening, and so it was interesting to be part of that process and to see the interaction between, since the photographer and the participant. And it was in no way one-sided. It was a collaboration, a collaborative project. So, yeah.
Yeah, you already talked about Kun-san's film, but do you want to say anything about Laura's photos, given this context?
The other films, I'm wondering if I want to say, should I talk about the photographs?
Please, yeah.
I had talked about the archives, right. The photographs here, I think also I find Lodra's photographs with her father incredibly striking. For me, the embodied sense of presence in those photographs is what's so striking. To me, and the physicality of her father, and in many ways the intimacy of that relationship, I think, comes through very strongly in those photographs. And then to me, the father then becomes, for Lodro, the father in a sense becomes Tibet, because his body has moved, and this reminded me very much of your novel as well, Tsering, where the body that came from Tibet holds this power that physically moved from Tibet into exile for those who were born outside of Tibet, and the power of that physical body, and I think that comes through in the photographs very strongly.
Thank you so much. So like Tsering, like your book is written in English, but I think you really care about the importance of translation, both culturally and literally, right? So how would you navigate between different languages and different words to talk about Tibet?
What? Sorry?
How would you navigate between different languages and different words to talk about Tibet?
How would I navigate between different languages and different worlds? I don't know. It's just how I live, I guess. yeah, so most Tibetans speak multiple languages just because we live in other people's countries. So we have to. And that it's languages, but also worldviews. We're conscious of not being in the center. And I think people who are in the center are the least conscious of that. But Tibetans just naturally are always not in their country, pretty much, even in Tibet. So there's this role, like a natural role of being a translator, of trying to understand other people, like almost like as an anthropologist, de facto. You're living in other people's worlds, you're living in other people's logics, languages, histories, and very little of your own reality is reflected around you. So I think it's almost hard for me to describe what it would, I can't really imagine what it would be like to not live like that. I guess when I'm like briefly in northern India, in like Ladakh, or when I'm in Dharamsala, I get a glimpse of what it would feel like if I lived in a world in which my family and my relatives and friends' perspectives, language, histories were at the center. But that's not the reality that we live in.
Okay, thank you. So just, wondering if you have anything else you want to talk about your own work as a writer, as an anthropologist, or about the Tibet or the exhibition? Just open question, both of you. No? Yeah, thinking.
Since you just spoke, I'm getting the sense I'm supposed to speak. I think, as I mentioned, I've been drawn to photography as a. I was about to say as an alternative to academic writing, but I think what I find most compelling is when they can come together, and so then when the photographs can do theoretical work, and I think that in this exhibition, I think that that's part of much of what I find compelling, and is I had spoken about sort of reclaiming the archive a little bit, but I think what's also interesting in Kunzang's work is she's somehow able to bring about this will sound strange. Normally we think of images on the one side as representation, and then real life materiality as tangible as something else. And I think what the Kunzang's film does is it shows us the materiality of the image itself. And there are scenes in the film in which we move through the negatives being sort of reverse processing and turning into a positive image. And those scenes emphasize that there was a moment of light from 100 years ago in that place that manifested on a piece of film, and that somehow that is being sort of moved into the present for us, even though of course it's being digitally projected onto a screen. But that materiality, I think, comes through the materiality of images, which sounds paradoxical, but I think that comes through very strongly here. And then in her animated work also, where you actually get print photographs that are sort of bouncing along in a river, being sort of moved by water, which again, the image is part of our physical life. And so that's somehow very hard, I think that's hard. That's difficult to do as someone who tries to do that and unsuccessfully. To see someone who does it successfully is very powerful, and I think that's come through with those works. And I've already spoken to the physicality in Lodro's work, so I think that's what I found most moving here.
Thank you. Actually, Kun-san was more interested in the negatives rather than the prints. So that kind of comes through in her film, I think. Thank you. Anything else?
Sunlight. So your question was?
Anything you want to talk about?
I think for me, one of the most powerful pieces, and this is something I've heard friends who, reflect similarly, is the 169, the portraits of the 169 Tibetans who self-immolated. Just the very act of making those portraits is very powerful. What Lodro's done there, but also the story of how she collected the ash from the Tibetan community, helping to gather that ash to make that artwork, is very emblematic of the particular nature of how community bound we are, and how there's a willingness to help each other, especially when it's something that is so about the community as well. So I found that whole thing to be extremely personal and moving and beautiful, and obviously triggering too, like for any Tibetan to enter into that room and to look at those images is extremely triggering. But I think Tibetan existence is triggering. But I think it's beautiful what she's done. So I just want to, again, praise Lodro's incredible contributions to this exhibit.
Thank you. I thank the speakers. I also want to thank my student assistant, three Tibetan Canadian students, Doji, Jamie, and Pema. Thank you so much. Also the Len and Amy and Wei Chen. They're all helping today. Thank you so much. And also, please join me thanking our speakers today. Thank you.